What really happened in a Wild West train robbery? Not the movie version, the real one. No heroic bandits, no clean getaways, no bags of gold, just the truth as it was. If you've ever been curious about what it was actually like, it's time to find out. Between 1870 and 1900, there were over 300 documented train robberies in the American West, and every robbery followed a similar pattern. Understanding that pattern shows you just how dangerous and desperate these crimes really were. Train robberies didn't just happen on a whim. Successful gangs spent weeks or even months planning every detail. They needed to know the train schedule, the route, the number of guards, and most importantly, what the train was carrying. Gang members would pose as regular passengers riding the same route multiple times. They'd note where the express car was positioned, how many armed guards were aboard, and where the train slowed down naturally. They'd watch the crew's routines, memorize the layout of each car, and identify potential weak points. Some outlaws worked with corrupt railroad employees who tipped them off about valuable shipments. A baggage handler might let slip that a particular train was carrying a mining company payroll. A telegraph operator might reveal when gold shipments were scheduled. These inside men were crucial, and they'd get a cut of the take if the robbery succeeded, usually between 10 and 20% of the total haul. The James Younger Gang was famous for this kind of planning. Before their 1873 robbery of the Rock Island Railroad, they spent 2 months studying the route. They knew exactly which train carried the Chicago money shipment, and they knew it would slow down at a particular curve near Adair, Iowa. They'd ridden that route as passengers at least 6 times. They'd timed the train's speed at different points. They'd identified every possible escape route within a 5-mile radius. By the time they pulled off the robbery, they knew that stretch of track better than the engineer himself. But planning wasn't just about knowing the schedule. Gangs had to choose the right location, and this was critical. They needed a spot where the train would naturally slow down, a curve, a grade, or a water stop. They needed cover nearby, rocks, trees, or ravines where they could hide before the attack. And they needed escape routes, multiple paths out in case lawmen showed up faster than expected. Mountain passes were ideal because trains had to slow to a crawl going uphill. Some passes forced trains down to 10 or 15 miles per hour, giving gangs plenty of time to board. Water stops were good too because the train had to stop completely. Locomotives needed to refill their water tanks every 50 to 100 miles, and these stops were predictable. Some gangs would even damage the track slightly, forcing the engineer to slow down to inspect it. Once they'd chosen the location, the gang would camp nearby for days, watching the trains pass. They'd time everything down to the minute, how long it took the train to stop, how long before the crew realized what was happening, how much time they had before someone could ride for help. This wasn't impulsive crime. This was military-style planning. And the gangs that survived longest were the ones who planned best. Once the gang was in position, they had to actually stop the train. And there were several methods, each with its own risks. The most common method was blocking the tracks. Gangs would pile logs, rocks, or even railroad ties across the rails. They'd build an obstruction large enough that the engineer couldn't possibly miss it. Sometimes they'd use an entire fallen tree dragged across the tracks with horses. When the engineer saw the obstruction, he'd have no choice but to stop or risk derailing the entire train. But this method had a problem. It gave the crew time to prepare. As soon as the engineer spotted the blockage, he knew what was coming. He'd blow the whistle to alert the guards, and sometimes he'd try to reverse the train before the gang could reach them. Express messengers would lock themselves in the express car and prepare to defend it. The element of surprise was lost, so some gangs used a more dangerous method. They'd remove a section of rail. This was incredibly risky because if the engineer didn't spot it in time, the train would derail. And a derailed train meant dead passengers, destroyed cargo, and possibly dead gang members. The Reno Gang tried this method in 1868 near Marshfield, Indiana. They pulled up a rail section, but the engineer spotted it and stopped just in time. The gang got their money, but the close call spooked them. Other gangs used false signals. They'd wave a red lantern, the universal signal for danger, forcing the engineer to stop. This worked well at night when the engineer couldn't see who was waving the lantern. Some gangs would dress in railroad uniforms to make the signal look official. The engineer, trained to stop for any red signal, would bring the train to a halt. By the time he realized it was a trap, guns would already be pointed at his head. Once the train stopped, the gang would rush from cover. Usually, they'd have men on both sides of the train to prevent anyone from escaping. The leader would approach the locomotive with his gun drawn and order the engineer and firemen to climb down. This was a critical moment, because if the engineer refused or tried to reverse the train, the gang would shoot him. And they did. Engineers and firemen were often the first casualties of train robberies. In 1877, Sam Bass and his gang stopped a Union Pacific train near Big Springs, Nebraska. When the engineer hesitated, Bass shot him in the leg. The message was clear: cooperate or die. Once the crew was subdued, the gang would uncouple the express car from the rest of the train. This was smart strategy. It isolated the car with the valuables and prevented passengers from interfering. Then they'd force the engineer to pull the express car forward, away from the passenger cars. Sometimes they'd move it a quarter mile down the track. This gave them privacy to work on the safe without worrying about armed passengers or guards in the other cars. Now came the hardest part: getting into the express car and opening the safe. Express cars were specifically designed to resist robbery. They had reinforced doors, heavy locks, and armed guards inside. The doors were often made of thick oak planks reinforced with iron bars. The windows were small and barred. There was usually only one door, and it could be barred from the inside. The express messenger, the guard inside, had orders to defend the cargo with his life. And many of them did. These men were paid well by the standards of the time, usually $75 to $100 a month, but they earned every penny. The gang would start by ordering the messenger to open the door. They'd threaten to blow up the car or set it on fire if he didn't comply. They'd fire warning shots through the walls. Sometimes the messenger would surrender immediately, especially if he was outnumbered and outgunned. He'd calculate that his life was worth more than the railroad's money. But other times he'd refuse, and that's when things got violent. Some express messengers took their duty seriously. They'd barricade themselves inside using mail sacks and crates as cover, and they'd fire back through the door at the outlaws. The gang would shoot through the door, trying to hit the messenger inside, and they'd fire dozens of rounds, splintering the wood and hoping to get lucky. When bullets didn't work, they'd throw dynamite at the door, or place it against the hinges. The explosions were often massive, far more powerful than necessary. Gangs didn't know much about explosives, so they'd use way too much. This would blow the door off, sure, but it would also destroy part of the car and sometimes damage the very cargo they were trying to steal. Paper money would catch fire. Coins would scatter across the countryside. In 1899, Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch robbed a Union Pacific train near Wilcox, Wyoming. They used so much dynamite on the express car that the explosion scattered money and debris across 100 yards. Bills were found stuck in trees. Coins were embedded in the ground. They spent precious minutes gathering up the bills while the clock ticked. Once inside the express car, the gang faced another obstacle: the safe. These weren't simple lock boxes. They were heavy iron safes designed to withstand attacks. Some weighed over 1,000 pounds. They had thick walls, complex lock mechanisms, and were bolted to the floor of the car. Some had time locks that couldn't be opened until a preset time. These were particularly frustrating for robbers because even if they had the combination, the safe wouldn't open. Others had combination locks that only the messenger knew. If the messenger was dead or unconscious, the gang was stuck. So they'd use more dynamite and they'd pack explosives around the safe, light the fuse, and run. The explosion would either blow the safe open or blow it apart. Sometimes it would blow the safe completely out of the express car. It would land 50 feet away, still locked, buried in dirt and debris. Either way, it was loud and it attracted attention. Lawmen and railroad detectives could hear dynamite explosions from miles away. Every minute the gang spent trying to open the safe was a minute closer to getting caught. Some gangs brought professional safe crackers, men who knew how to use nitroglycerin or drill through the lock mechanism. These specialists were valuable because they could open safes quickly and quietly. but they were also rare and expensive. They demanded a larger cut of the take, sometimes as much as 25%. Most gangs just used brute force and hoped for the best. While some gang members worked on the express car, others would move through the passenger cars. This is where things got really ugly. Passengers were ordered to hand over their money, watches, jewelry, and anything else of value. Women were told to remove their rings and necklaces. Men had to empty their pockets. The gang members would walk down the aisle with grain sacks collecting valuables. They'd threaten anyone who hesitated. Your money or your life wasn't just a saying, it was a literal choice. Some passengers tried to hide their money in their boots or under their seats. If the gang caught them, they'd beat them as an example to others. One passenger getting beaten was usually enough to make everyone else cooperate immediately. Resistance was met with violence. If a passenger pulled a gun, the gang would shoot him immediately. No warnings, no second chances. If someone tried to run, they'd shoot him in the back. Train robberies weren't gentlemanly affairs, they were brutal shakedowns. There are accounts of gang members pistol whipping elderly men and threatening women. Children would watch in terror as their parents were robbed at gunpoint. The romantic image of the polite outlaw who only robbed the rich is mostly fiction. Most train robbers were desperate, violent men who'd kill without hesitation. That said, some gangs did have rules. Jesse James reportedly told his men not to rob working-class passengers, only the wealthy ones. He'd supposedly ask passengers their occupation before deciding whether to rob them. Farmers and laborers were left alone. Businessmen and bankers were cleaned out. Whether this actually happened or was just legend is debatable, but it made for good press and helped build his Robin Hood image. The passenger robbery usually took 10 to 15 minutes. The gang had to work fast because every minute increased the risk of lawmen arriving. Once they'd collected everything of value, they'd order everyone to stay in their seats. Then they'd back out of the cars, keeping their guns trained on the passengers. Anyone who tried to follow would be shot. Now came the most dangerous part: getting away. The gang would have horses waiting nearby, usually hidden in a ravine or behind rocks. They'd mount up and ride hard in multiple directions. This was deliberate strategy. Splitting up made it harder for pozzies to follow. If the posse followed one rider, the others would escape. If they split up to follow multiple riders, each group would be smaller and easier to fight off. The gang would have pre-planned meeting points. They'd ride separately for several miles, then regroup at a designated location. Maybe an abandoned cabin, a cave, or a remote canyon. This way, if one member was caught or killed, the others could still escape. The first few hours after the robbery were critical. The gang needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the crime scene. They'd ride through the night, changing horses at relay points they'd set up beforehand. Some gangs had fresh horses stashed every 20 miles, allowing them to keep moving while pozzies tired out. A fresh horse could maintain a gallop for miles, while a tired horse would slow to a walk. They'd avoid main roads and towns, sticking to wilderness areas where tracking was difficult. They'd ride through streams to hide their trail. Water didn't hold hoof prints, and it confused tracking dogs. They'd split up and reunite multiple times to confuse trackers, but escape wasn't guaranteed. Railroad companies hired professional detectives specifically to hunt down train robbers. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was the most famous and most feared. Pinkertons were relentless. They'd track gangs for months, even years. They had resources that local sheriffs didn't: access to railroad records, telegraph networks, and informants across multiple states. They'd offer rewards for information leading to arrests. Sometimes the rewards were substantial: $5,000 or more for a famous outlaw. That was enough money to make even loyal friends consider betrayal. They'd infiltrate gangs by posing as criminals themselves. A Pinkerton agent might spend months building trust, participating in smaller crimes, until he was invited to join a train robbery. And they weren't bound by the same legal restrictions as lawmen. Pinkertons would cross state lines, pursue suspects into Mexico, and use whatever force necessary to bring them in. Dead or alive wasn't just a saying, it was policy. Many train robbers were killed by Pinkertons, not arrested. The James Younger gang learned this the hard way. After their disastrous 1876 Northfield, Minnesota bank robbery, Pinkertons hunted them relentlessly. They tracked the younger brothers to a farmhouse and shot it out with them. The youngers were wounded multiple times but survived. They were captured and sent to prison. Jesse and Frank James escaped, but spent the rest of their lives on the run. They could never stay in one place for long. They used false names, moved constantly, and trusted no one. So after all that planning, violence, and risk, what did train robbers actually get? The answer varies wildly. Some robberies netted huge amounts. The 1899 Wilcox, Wyoming robbery by Butch Cassidy's gang brought in over $30,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $1 million today. Sam Bass's 1877 Big Springs robbery netted $60,000 in newly minted $20 gold pieces. That's almost $2 million in today's money. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. Most train robberies brought in far less. Many gangs risked their lives for a few $100s. The average take was probably between $1,000 and $3,000. Sometimes the safe would be empty or contain nothing but papers. The gang would blow it open only to find registered mail and documents. No cash, no gold, nothing of value. And remember, the take had to be split among all the gang members. A $5,000 robbery split 6 ways meant each man got about $830. Not bad for 1880, but hardly the fortune Hollywood portrays. Plus, the gang had expenses. They had to pay informants, buy supplies, replace horses, and sometimes bribe lawmen. Informants typically got 10 to 20%. Supplies, ammunition, dynamite, food, all cost money. By the time everything was paid for, the actual profit was often modest. Each gang member might walk away with a few $100s, enough to live on for a few months, but not enough to retire. And there was another problem, spending the money. Stolen bills often had recorded serial numbers. Banks and merchants were warned to watch for them. If you tried to spend a stolen bill, you'd be arrested immediately. Gold coins were easier to spend, but they were heavy and hard to transport. $1,000 in gold coins weighed about 3 pounds, $10,000 weighed 30 pounds. That's a lot of weight to carry on horseback, especially when you're trying to move fast. Some gangs buried their loot, planning to retrieve it later. They'd hide it in a remote location, mark it somehow, and plan to come back when things cooled down. But if they were killed or captured before they could dig it up, the money stayed buried. There are still legends of hidden train robbery loot scattered across the West. Train robbery was a federal crime, and the penalties were severe. If caught, robbers faced 20 years to life in prison. If anyone was killed during the robbery, the charge was murder and the penalty was hanging, and the conviction rate was high. Railroad companies had money and influence. They'd hire the best prosecutors and make sure robbers got maximum sentences. Juries had little sympathy for train robbers, especially after the 1890s when robberies became more violent. The public had initially romanticized outlaws like Jesse James. Newspapers portrayed them as rebels fighting against corrupt railroads. Dime novels turned them into heroes. But as robberies became bloodier and more innocent people died, that romance faded. By 1900, train robbers were seen as what they really were, violent criminals. Many famous outlaws met bad ends. Jesse James was shot in the back by a gang member hoping to collect the reward. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were reportedly killed in Bolivia, though some dispute this. The Dalton gang was nearly wiped out trying to rob 2 banks simultaneously in Coffeyville, Kansas. 4 gang members were killed, and the 5th was captured and imprisoned. Blackjack Ketchum was hanged in 1901 for train robbery. The hanging was botched, and he was decapitated. The few outlaws who survived long enough to retire usually did so in poverty. The money was gone, spent on supplies, bribes, and lawyers. They'd lived on the run for years, unable to settle down or use their real names. By 1910, train robberies had largely disappeared. Several factors contributed to this. First, railroads improved security. They hired more guards, installed better safes, and equipped express cars with alarm systems. Some trains carried armed posses specifically to fight off robbers. Express cars were redesigned with reinforced walls and doors. Safes became heavier and more sophisticated. Second, communication improved. Telegraph lines allowed news of robberies to spread instantly. A robbery in Wyoming could be reported to lawmen in Colorado within minutes. Lawmen could be waiting at the next station before the gang even finished robbing the train. Third, law enforcement became more professional. The days of incompetent local sheriffs were ending. State and federal agencies took over pursuit of train robbers. They had better training, better equipment, and better coordination. Fourth, the West was becoming civilized. Towns were growing, roads were improving, and wilderness areas were shrinking. There were fewer places for outlaws to hide. The open range that had protected gangs in the 1870s was fenced and settled by 1900. And finally, automobiles changed everything. By 1920, criminals had switched to robbing banks using cars for getaway vehicles. Cars were faster than horses and could travel on roads that pauses couldn't follow. The era of the horseback outlaw was over. So what actually happened in a Wild West train robbery? It wasn't romantic. It was brutal. It wasn't spontaneous. It was carefully planned. It wasn't victimless. Innocent people died. The outlaws weren't heroes. They were desperate, violent men. Most train robbers didn't get rich. They got caught or killed. The few who succeeded spent the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Hollywood gave us Jesse James as a gentleman bandit. The reality was a man who shot unarmed clerks and terrorized passengers. Hollywood gave us Butch Cassidy as a charming rogue. The reality was a career criminal who used dynamite so recklessly he endangered everyone nearby. The real train robberies were messy, chaotic, and often ended in failure. Gangs would spend months planning only to find the safe empty. They'd risk their lives for a few $100s. They'd kill men over pocket watches, and when they were finally caught, they'd hang or rot in prison. The Wild West train robbery wasn't an adventure. It was a crime born of desperation, carried out with violence and ending in tragedy. From the careful planning to the brutal execution to the inevitable capture, these robberies reveal something important about the American West. It wasn't a land of freedom and opportunity for everyone. For some, it was a place where desperation drove men to violence, where the gap between rich and poor was so wide that risking death seemed worth it. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories.